Like, well, we made it to just about Thanksgiving this year, and I don't know. I don't think I'm going to remember really anything about it fondly, except there is one kind of neat thing in the works, and it's that the 737 MAX finally came back to service. And I bet you heard about that. But I've got a few articles today that I want to read to you because there's just so much interesting backstory behind this, and I've tried to cover it as well as I can up until now, but it just seemed like it kept getting worse and worse and worse. But now I think it's getting better. I mean, like a lot better. And the FAA agrees because they've released the 737 MAX to fly. Almost. So today I'm going to read a couple of articles to you, which I hope are going to cover that just as well as I possibly can. And of course, these are not my work. They are the respective works of their respective authors. And I ask that you go like and follow and subscribe or whatever. But the first one's going to come from Reuters, and then we got a bunch of them from Aerotime News Hub. And then I'll have some comments at the end, of course. But intros aside, really, I just want to get right into this. And our first article does come from Reuters. It says the FAA chief 100% confident of the 737 MAX's safety as flights to resume. And it's by Dave Shepardson. He writes from Washington, U.S. FAA Chief Steve Dickson is, quote, 100% confident in the safety of the 737 MAX, but says the airplane maker has more to do as it works to improve its safety culture. Dickson on Wednesday signed an order to allow the best-selling plane to resume flights after it was grounded worldwide in March 2019, following 2 crashes that killed 346 people and led to Boeing's biggest crisis in decades. The order will end the longest grounding in commercial aviation history, and it paves the way for Boeing to resume U.S. deliveries and commercial flights by the end of the year. Quote, we've done everything humanly possible to make sure these types of crashes do not happen again, FAA Administrator Dickson told Reuters in a 30-minute telephone interview, adding that the design changes, quote, have eliminated what caused those particular accidents. The FAA is requiring new training to deal with key safety system called MCAS that is faulted for the 2 fatal crashes, as well as significant new safeguards and other software changes. Quote, I feel 100% confident, said Dickson, a former airline and military pilot who took over as FAA administrator in August of 2019, and he took the controls for a 737 MAX test flight in September. In a video message released on Wednesday, he said that the 20-month review was, quote, long and grueling, but we said from the start that we would take the time necessary to get this right, end quote. Dickson said he emphasized to Boeing the importance of safety. Quote, I understand that they have a business to run, but they don't have anything if they don't have a safe product, Dickson said. Dickson suggested Boeing has more to do to improve safety. Quote, they have taken some actions, but it's going to take more than putting new processes in place and moving boxes around the organization chart. Cultural changes take a long time to take effect, and we've got to be skeptical, he said. Boeing said it's, quote, committed to learning from our mistakes and to build a safer future so accidents like this never happen again. The FAA also has come under harsh criticism over its certification of the 737 MAX. The U.S. House of Representatives approved a reform measure on Tuesday of the FAA's aircraft certification program. Representative Peter DeFazio, a Democrat who chairs the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, said the FAA failed to properly ensure the safety of the 737 MAX, and he called aircraft certification, quote, a broken system that broke the public's trust, end quote. Dickson acknowledged that there was a fragmented communication within the FAA and between the FAA and Boeing during the 737 MAX certification. He noted the agency is adopting certification reforms and improvements in response to outside reviews of the 737 MAX certification. The FAA could take new enforcement actions or issue new civil penalties against Boeing over the MAX and on issues stemming from a 2014 settlement agreement, but Dickson did not elaborate. Quote, it's a matter of our review of what Boeing's actions have been up to this point, Dickson said. Quote, there's going to be more that we'll be able to talk about in the coming weeks and months. The MCAS, or Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, is designed to help counter a tendency of the nose of the 737 MAX to rise up, known as a pitch up, and it can be activated after data is received from one of 2 sensors. Boeing says inputs from both sensors on the MAX will be used after the updates, but the European Union Aviation Safety Agency has called for a third synthetic sensor to provide independently computed data. Dickson said that the FAA will consider requiring that synthetic sensor in future 737 MAX versions, but has made no decisions. Dickson said that he expects other international regulators will, quote, complete their work within a relatively short period of time. Again, that article from Reuters and reported by David Shepardson and edited by Christian Schmollinger. Our next article comes from Aerotime News Hub, and I really like them because they provide a lot of the more interesting backstory sometimes, but in a quick manner, so you can kind of get the story, but without reading a 29-page report on it. But this one's by Ritis Barasnevigus, and it says, the FAA ungrounds the Boeing 737 MAX. The FAA ungrounded the 737 MAX, allowing it to enter commercial service again. The 737 MAX will be able to rejoin airline fleets as soon as all the tasks in the aircraft maintenance manual regarding returning the aircraft from storage is completed. In addition, the newly developed software to change the architecture of the MCAS has to be installed as well. So far, Boeing has delivered 387 of the now ungrounded jets to customers across the globe. In addition, 395 built units have waited for the all-clear to be delivered to their final customers. However, some have become white tails, which are aircraft without an airline's logo painted on the tail fin, as some customers canceled their orders over the debacle. The jet returned to service for the first time since March 2019 when a second fatal crash in Ethiopia, the 737 MAX, prompted aviation authorities to withdraw the MAX from service due to the then alleged similarities between the Lion Air Flight 610, the first fatal accident of the type, and then the crash in Indonesia, which occurred in October of 2018. In total, the two crashes claimed the lives of 346 people, including crew and passengers. However, before it can return, the aircraft must go through a 7-step pre-operational readiness flight audit, which includes tasks from the aircraft maintenance manual, installation of the newest software, angle of attack system test, in addition to other items in the audit. Following the domino effect grounding, the saga included such events as Boeing's own chief executive being ousted from the company in late December 2019, the company suspending production of the 737 MAX, or the fact that authorities like the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, have swayed from their bilateral agreement with the U.S. over certification delegation. Pilot training, which previously consisted of a theoretical lecture, will now include ground and flight training in a full flight simulator before pilots can fly the aircraft. The changes were made following the recommendations by Boeing and the Flight Standardization Board, FSB, and the Joint Operations Evaluation Board, JOEB. Deeper investigations, including by U.S.-based politicians, could also shift the way the FAA certifies aircraft. The United States House of Representatives voted to introduce changes in the way the governmental agency certifies commercial planes. Before the proposed bill comes into effect, it'll have to pass the U.S. Senate and be signed by the President. Like I said before, Aerotime has kind of a neat way of coming at things from an angle that you might not expect and still doing it relatively quickly. Rightus Barris Nevixis writes another article called Which Airlines Will Fly Boeing 737 MAX? An aircraft that's turned from a game changer into a troublemaker is set to once again change the game of aviation economics. As safety authorities across the globe clear the 737 MAX to operate commercial flights once again, who are the airlines that'll fly customers on board the aircraft? Overall, Boeing delivered 387 jets before it was grounded in March 2019, following the second fatal accident in Ethiopia, where an Ethiopian Airlines MAX crashed near Addis Ababa. The airline with the most MAXs grounded was Southwest, while three carriers split the title of second largest 737 MAX fleet, namely Air Canada, American, and China Southern, with 24 aircraft each. And then in third place was Norwegian Air Shuttle. Split by continent, flyers in Central and North America can expect to see the most already delivered 737 MAX aircraft. The second largest diaspora of 737 MAXs is located in Asia, where out of the 119 total delivered aircraft, 82 are located in China. Incidentally, China was the first aviation authority to ground the aircraft after the Ethiopian 302 crash, not allowing 21% of the global 737 MAX fleet to fly commercially instantly. Despite the grounding in March 2019, Boeing kept producing the aircraft as the manufacturer hoped to quickly turn the corner and the 737 MAX to return to service in a few months' time. However, the few months turned into a saga that has now entered its 20th month. The manufacturer kept producing jets from March 2019 until January 2020, when the production in Renton, Washington was paused. In May 2020, production resumed once again, and so far, Boeing has had to store 395 aircraft as it was unable to deliver them to customers. But which airline has the largest backlog of undelivered jets? Well, Southwest is number one, with 33, followed by China Southern with 25, Ryanair, 18, United with 16, and then American and SpiceJet with 15 each. And if you'd like to see the graphics that accompany that, there's of course a link in the show notes. The rest of the Aerotime team has put together another article that's kind of interesting about how other regulators around the world, particularly in this case Brazil, are responding to the MAX ungrounding. This one, called Brazilian Regulator Responds to Boeing 737 MAX Ungrounding, says, despite the 737 MAX ungrounding in the United States, the Brazilian Aviation Safety Authority says it has yet to decide if the airliner meets its airworthiness requirements. Brazil's National Civil Aviation Agency, ANAC, acknowledges the decision of its U.S. counterpart, the FAA, to unground the Boeing 737 MAX. However, the airliner will be allowed to return to Brazilian skies only after the ANAC determines it's safe and meets airworthiness requirements. The ANAC stated that the 737 MAX 8 return to operations in the country still depended on the completion of the work carried out by the agency regarding the process of validating the project modifications, according to a statement released on November 18, 2020. The announcement came in response to the news that the FAA approved necessary modifications of the aircraft, essentially clearing its return to passenger operations in the United States. While the ANAC, together with other aviation authorities such as Transport Canada and the European Aviation Safety Agency, participated in the FAA's work, the Brazilian authority still intends to proceed with its own final adjustments for the validation process. It would be done based on the FAA guideline, the ANAC stated. Quote, "This effort is an example of coordination between civil aviation authorities. Only a few countries have the experience to certify such a complex system. However, ANAC works with the independent assessments to ensure that all necessary requirements will be met in the safe return of the operations to these aircraft in Brazil." Rafael Botelho, the deputy CEO of ANAC, is cited in the statement as saying, "Currently, there's only one airline in Brazil that has 737 MAX 8 in its fleet, Gol. The carrier, which has 7 already delivered but grounded aircraft of the type, would have to incorporate and demonstrate, quote, satisfactory compliance with all the new guidelines, both in terms of design and pilot training," the authority added. Now, that's the end of the article, and normally I wouldn't read the responses, but there is one on here I really liked. It's by Cert Guy, and he states in reference to the article, "I love it when they state, quote, only a few countries have the experience to certify such a complex system. Unfortunately, from what I've seen ANAC approved in the past, I don't include them in the list. Technical knowledge does not equate to ethical behavior. The FAA definitely needs to look at themselves and how they do business, but the way other regulatory agencies are pointing fingers when poor ethics is their modus operandi makes it all kind of ludicrous." There you go. And it looks like Brazil isn't the only company not blindly agreeing to this. Again, by Rightus Parisnevicus at Aerotime News Hub, he writes Canada to not follow FAA in ungrounding the MAX. Transport Canada, the Canadian authority responsible for civil aviation, released a statement that there would be differences between it and the FAA regarding the 737 MAX ungrounding. The FAA ungrounded the Boeing 737 MAX on November 18, 2020, following 20 months of hibernation after the second fatal accident involving the aircraft type occurred in Ethiopia in March 2019. However, the grounding period seemingly undermined the FAA's global status as several aviation authorities, including Transport Canada and EASA, indicated they would conduct independent reviews of the 737 MAX. Previously, via bilateral agreements, the FAA was a designated certifying authority for commercial aircraft built in the United States. Quote, "We acknowledge that the United States FAA has released an airworthiness directive for the 737 MAX aircraft. In a statement, commented Transport Canada. Quote, "Transport Canada safety experts continue their independent validation process to determine whether to approve the proposed changes to the aircraft." End quote. However, according to the Canadian authority, there would be differences between its eventual approval and the FAA's clearance. Namely, these differences would include additional procedures on the flight deck during pre-flight and variation in pilot training prior to the ungrounding of the MAX. Quote, "The commercial flight restrictions for the operation of the 737 MAX aircraft in Canadian airspace remain in effect and will not be lifted until the department is fully satisfied that all its safety concerns have been addressed and that enhanced flight crew procedures and training are in place in Canada," the statement reads. Transport Canada has not indicated a preliminary timeline of its own approval for operations to unground the MAX, instead stating that it expected the process to conclude very soon. In Canada, there are 3 operators of the 737 MAX, Air Canada, Sunwing Airlines, and WestJet. And so after all that, it kind of begs the question, is the FAA's status as a global aviation authority crumbling? Well, maybe I wouldn't put it that way exactly, but that's what the article says from Aerotime News Hub, again by Rightus Parisnevicus. It says the FAA throughout the recent history of commercial aviation has been the global leader for aviation safety and, in the same vein, certification. Whenever a decision was made by the FAA, the world would follow suit. However, could the fallout from the 737 MAX crisis result in the FAA losing its status as a global leader of aviation authorities around the globe? Historically, the FAA held the flag and was the leader on all fronts. When the DC-10 was grounded, for example, the U.S.-based authority was at the forefront of the decision. So in the lead, the airlines based in Europe sued the FAA for allegedly overstepping its boundaries when the agency banned foreign registered DC-10s to operate within the United States' airspace. Nevertheless, after the administration had grounded the trijet, a number of foreign governments halted DC-10 flights in their airspace, reported the New York Times in September back in 1981. A more recent example could be the 787 Dreamliner groundings. After the 787 suffered several incidents involving its APUs and the lithium-ion batteries, the FAA grounded the wide-body on January 16, 2013. A day later, EASA issued a statement whereupon the agency commented that it was working closely with the FAA as, quote, the primary certification authority and Boeing. EASA has this morning adopted the FAA Airworthiness Directive in order to ensure the continuing airworthiness of the European fleet, end quote, the statement read. At the time, the European fleet consisted of 2 Boeing 787 Dreamliners operated by LOT Polish Airlines. The Japan Civil Aviation Bureau, JCAB, followed the FAA as well, as the Bureau, quote, issued the Airworthiness Directives Kokuki No. 92 based on the above-mentioned FAA Airworthiness Directive, end quote, which ordered the groundings of the Dreamliner. Coincidentally, the 2 battery fires that prompted the suspension of operations of the 787 had been on Japanese-registered aircraft belonging to Japan Airlines and All Nippon. Reverse roles with the 737 MAX. The second fatal crash of the 737 MAX seemingly created a rift between aviation authorities worldwide. On Sunday, March 10, 2019, Ethiopian Airlines' MAX plunged into the ground shortly after departure. On Monday, March 11, 2019, the Civil Aviation Administration of China, CAAC, ordered all Chinese airlines to suspend all commercial operations with the 737 MAX. Quote, given the similarities between the two accidents and the aircraft involved in both crashes were newly certified Boeing 737-8 and both happened during takeoff, CAAC issued a notice at 9 a.m. on March 11th requiring domestic airlines to suspend the commercial operations of Boeing 737-8 by 6 p.m., end quote. The next day, EASA followed suit. Quote, EASA issued a safety directive 2019-01 suspending commercial air transport operations with the Boeing 737-8 MAX and 737-9 MAX by third country operators into, within, or out of the territory subject to the provisions of the Treaty on European Union, end quote. The FAA was one of the last agencies to react. On March 13, 2019, the authority ordered a temporary grounding of 737 MAX aircraft, quote, as a result of the data gathering process and new evidence collected at the site and analyzed today, read a statement by the FAA. Boeing put the final nail in. Despite stating that the company had full confidence in the safety of the 737 MAX on March 12th, the following day, the manufacturer issued a recommendation to the FAA to temporarily suspend the entire global fleet of 371 delivered 737 MAX aircraft. Quote, Boeing has determined out of an abundance of caution and, in order to reassure the flying public of the aircraft's safety, reasoned the manufacturer at the time. Long-standing rift. The rift that had appeared as timelines of the groundings of the 737 MAX differed has only continued to deepen as the crisis has kept going. Aviation authorities have indicated that they would not dance to the same tune as the FAA. In preparation to unground the jet, they would conduct test flights on their own accord. In September 2019, EASA's executive director, Patrick Kai, appeared in front of the European Parliament's Committee on Transport and Tourism. Kai laid out the conditions for the aircraft to return to service in Europe, one of which was the fact that all design changes proposed by Boeing would be approved by the European agency without any delegation to the FAA. The decision was made despite a bilateral safety agreement between the European Union and the U.S., through which the FAA can approve certain design features of a given aircraft without the intervention of EASA. The second condition, which was, quote, not very popular with our American colleagues, noted Kai, was that the European agency would complete a broader overview of the design of the critical safety systems of the MAX. Due to the bilateral safety agreement, quote, those are the domains which we have not completely certified ourselves, added the executive director. The European regulator was not the only authority to communicate the need for a second opinion. Transport Canada insisted that it would validate Boeing and FAA's work before giving the 737 MAX a green light to fly above the skies of Canada. Quote, we have our own list of requirements that we sent to the FAA at the onset of this, of areas that we'll be looking at validating the work of the FAA and Boeing, prior to us issuing our own validation approval, remarked Director General of Civil Aviation, Nicholas Robinson, back in September 2019. United Arab Emirates' General Civil Aviation Authority, GCAA, chief executive, shared a very similar sentiment in the same month, stating that the GCAA would, quote, not follow the FAA, end quote, and that it would take a deeper look into the work that Boeing and subsequently the U.S. regulator had done. Australia's Civil Aviation Safety Authority, CASA, spokesperson noted that other regulators' decisions would, quote, form part of our thinking when the time came to make a decision whether to unground the aircraft in Australia. The rift also seemingly created a power vacuum, a vacuum that's possibly about to be sealed. EASA making strides. The governing body of Europe's aviation, EASA, seemingly has been making strides to seal the vacuum over this past year. On September 1st, its bilateral aviation safety agreement, BASA, with China's CAAC went into effect. The document was signed on May 20, 2019, 2 months following the second 737 MAX accident and the grounding of the type. BASA allows the two aviation authorities to collaborate and simplify bureaucratic processes, including the certification of civil aeronautical products. The Technical Implementation Procedures TIP document, which outlines the details of the agreement between the two authorities, indicates that either of the two can essentially approve an aeronautical product, and it would be validated and automatically accepted by the other. Type certificates and supplemental type certificates are included in the agreement. In addition to the fact that if either authority, quote, evokes or suspends a type certificate or supplemental type certificate for a civil aeronautical product for which they act as a certifying authority, that authority will immediately inform the other, reads the tip. If any action is deemed necessary after an investigation and the suspension is justified and the validating authority agrees with the CA's decision, well, then the former will revoke or suspend the type certificate or STC. The Chinese authority was not the only one that EASA shook hands with since the grounding of the 737 MAX. The European agency signed an agreement with Japan's Civil Aviation Bureau, JCAB, that will, quote, facilitate the validation of airworthiness certificates on aeronautical products between the EU and Japan, end quote. During the same presentation whereupon Patrick Kai proceeded to explain the steps before the grounded aircraft could be approved to fly in Europe, EASA's executive director also highlighted the agency's short-term future strategy. Quote, "We want to reinforce our presence on the international scene to support the European Union's external policy and the EU's citizens' needs," commented Kai. Prior to 2020, EASA had bilateral agreements with 3 authorities, namely the FAA, Transport Canada, and Brazil's Civil Aviation National Agency. Quite an increase considering the previously small number of bilateral agreements the European Union had. The FAA is unstable political ground. At the same time, the FAA had been standing on unstable political ground for quite a while now. Its leadership structure was shaky, as between January 2018 and August 2019, the agency had no permanent administrator. The current administrator, Stephen Dixon, was sworn in August 12, 2019, for a 5-year term. The current White House is not very welcoming towards the FAA in sustaining its global lead. Aviation as a global business is directly associated with international relations and decisions that are made there, stated Vygaudas Ušackas, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Lithuania and current member of the board of directors in Avia Solutions Group. Such events as the 9/11 terror attacks, sanctions towards Iran and Russia, and the trade war between China and the U.S., quote, perfectly illustrate how aviation is dependent on the development of international relations, added Ušackas. He continues, thus, companies invest in human resources not only to ensure their compliance with sanctions, but also to understand diplomatic processes and the political implications to investment projects and aftermarket support of its clientele. He commented further on aviation's relationship with international relations. The industry, as a global business, is inevitably affected not only by various natural phenomena, but also the state of affairs in international relations. Tightening budget. The FAA, however, has another problem: its budget. For financial year 2021, the agency requested $17.5 billion in government funds. The government will only allocate $14.2 billion, including $30 million to, quote, improve aviation oversight, following recommendations from the 737 MAX investigations and reviews, and to make investments in the systems that support the FAA's ongoing safety oversight, reads the White House's A Budget for America's Future document. The agency's been fighting an ever-tightening budget as the government sought to reduce spending. For example, Donald Trump signed Executive Order 13771 in January 2017, titled Reducing Regulation and Controlling Regulatory Costs. The order had the intention for executive branches, including the FAA, to, quote, be prudent and financially responsible, end quote, in spending their funds from both public and private sources. Quote, in addition to the management of the direct expenditure of taxpayer dollars through the budgeting process, it's essential to manage the costs associated with the governmental imposition of private expenditures required to comply with federal regulations. Furthermore, for every new regulation that an agency would introduce, at least 2 prior regulations would be identified for elimination, and that the cost of planned regulations be prudently managed and controlled through a budgeting process. Again, that article by Rightus Parisnevicus at Aerotime. So, mostly good news, but not entirely. Since the beginning of reading all these articles in the If It Ain't Boeing series, I have always hoped that you understand that I'm not trying to disparage Boeing or hate on Boeing. Quite the opposite. I look forward to a time again where Boeing is considered an engineering and design leader in the world. And I want the FAA, my employer, let's get that out of the way, to be world-renowned again as the best aviation authority around, and where everybody else says, hey, if the FAA certifies it, man, we know it's good. That's what I want. This has been quite a shakeup, and hopefully things will get back to normal, because more than anything, once again, I want to be able to say that if it ain't Boeing, I ain't going. So what do you think? Shoot me an email, Brandon@podcastingonaplane.com. Or if you got more thoughts than you can write down, you can use your smartphone or the SpeakPipe widget that pops up when you visit podcastingonaplane.com to record me something, and who knows, maybe we'll end up on a show. And while you're on the website, maybe consider supporting the show too. If you find value in it, I'd really appreciate having you on board as a patron. You get episodes early and sometimes other fun stuff too. And if you're not into the recurring thing, you could head over to buymeacoffee.com/Bravo Golf spelled out and do a one-time thing in an increment of just $3. And if you want to stay sharp on the mic, make sure to use the affiliate code DELTA at plainenglishsim.com. That'll get you 10% off the best smartphone-based ATC radio comm simulator around. There's, of course, a link in the show notes. And as always, I thank you so much for your support in whatever form it takes, and for listening to the show and passing the word along about this or any of your favorite aviation podcasts to a friend. Well, that's all for now. Your frequency changes approved until next time, and report back on this frequency for the next episode. Good day.
The Podcasting on a Plane podcast is presented for entertainment purposes only. Brandon's comments and those of his guests, the website's content and any of the social media, etc., are not part of his official responsibility as a controller or as an FAA employee. The views and opinions you hear on the podcast are his, and those of his guests, and not necessarily that of the FAA. Also, while he's a CFI, he's not acting as your CFI, nor is he your mechanic, your doctor, your shrink, or your spouse. This podcast is presented for entertainment, camaraderie and fun, but is in no way, shape or form professional advice or legal counsel. If you're in need of professional advice, get some from somewhere more appropriate than a podcast, no matter how good this one may be.